Nugent, I am delighted to welcome you to the Ingenious You community today.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm happy to be asked to be here.
Now, our listeners always like to know something about the background and the leadership journey of our guests. In your case, you've had a remarkable and somewhat varied professional journey, and a very interesting one, I might add. So, as the first in your family to go to college, your trajectory to a college presidency is most likely something you didn't have on your radar, I would imagine, at the outset.
I think that's absolutely true. I
So,
assumed I would be, I always liked school.
yeah.
And so I did think well, first I thought I wanted to be a teacher when I was in high school. And then when I got to college, I thought I wanted to be a college professor. But no, president was not on my radar.
So, how did you get there? And what were the influences or some of the factors that led to your eventually becoming a college president?
Yeah, well, I've tried to think back and figure this out. I think when I became a faculty member, I love teaching and I always loved teaching. But I did actually, as you may know, I became a faculty member back at my alma mater. And perhaps because of that sort of tie or pull, I was always sort of interested in the university as an organization.
Mm.
So, and of course, when I began my teaching career, there were very, very few women faculty. Certainly, uh, I was the first alumna to be appointed to the Princeton faculty, and there were only about 3 or 4 other women at that time. And so you know how that works. You serve on a lot of committees, right?
Mm.
But I actually found that I really enjoyed that kind of work. And at one time, I was on an advising committee to Bill Bowen, who was then the president. And so I didn't think of myself as getting at all as headed toward an administrative career. But looking back, I realized I've always been interested in how organizations function.
Mm.
So I went from Princeton to Brown and taught there for a number of years. And then I got a random call in the middle of one summer. I was actually teaching in the summer program up at Cornell, which is my graduate alma mater. And I suddenly got a call saying, we have a new president. This is a friend calling from Princeton, an administrator. He said, we have a new president and we think he needs an assistant. Would you be interested in being assistant to the president? And honestly, Melissa, I thought to myself, nah. But, you know, it might be fun to have a trip back to Princeton and talk with people. So I went back to campus. I met Harold Shapiro, was at that time the new president. He had previously been the president of the University of Michigan. And we just hit it off. And I thought, well, this seems interesting. So a little sidebar along the lines of, you and I spoke briefly about how unexpected journeys can be. A little sidebar is that I was actually up for tenure at Brown at that time. And I received tenure and I turned it down. And I mentioned that because I have always had serious concerns about the tenure system
Mm.
and its dysfunctionality in some ways. Anyway, I decided that I would rather leave, and I went back to Princeton, became the assistant to the president. Harold was a wonderful president, and actually there were many of us who I always hesitate to say he mentored us because I don't know how intentional it was, but at least 4 of the women who worked closely with Harold became college presidents.
No kidding.
Yeah. And so I did that role for a number of years. I think maybe 3 or 4. I don't even remember now. Then I moved over to be the associate provost, and I was in that role for maybe 4 years or so. And then we had just built a teaching and learning center, which had never existed on that campus, and I became the founding dean of that center. And then somehow I found myself in a presidential search.
Yeah. Well, it's I can see some of those influences along the way that propelled you forward. And your bio will be in the show notes. But I want to mention your discipline is the classics area, right?
Yeah,
And
I always like to say that, ancient Greek and Latin are perfect for heading up a multi-million-dollar corporation.
well, I was actually going to ask you about that because I do think there is quite a bit in the study of the classics that lends itself to thinking about leadership.
Yes, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I actually think, a number of years ago, when Bob Connor was the head of the Teagle Foundation,
Mhm.
I remember he held a convening, he would call them, and there was a group of us who were maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 kind of junior administrators sitting around in a circle. And he asked us whether our particular discipline influenced our administrative understanding or roles. And it was fascinating. Every one of us, no matter what we were, economists, philosophers, whatever, all said, "Oh yes, it definitely influences the way I think," and so forth. And I certainly feel that. You're right, particularly on the Roman side, there's certainly a lot to learn about leadership. Augustus is a particular interest of mine. And then I would say more on the Greek side, you know, it's uh, it's a little prejudiced, but I don't think we've done much better thinking than Plato and Aristotle got to. So just in terms of understanding our common humanity and the idea of living a good life and how you define that and carry it out.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, well, thank you for connecting those dots for us. Now, you've been described as a trailblazer and as a pioneer among women in higher ed. You've already noted some of the ways in which that has played out. Most immediately, you're the first woman to serve as president of Illinois Wesleyan University. So,
Mhm.
can you discuss some of the challenges you have faced in these pioneering roles? And what you've learned, but also maybe what your experience, um, how it can benefit other women, particularly emerging women leaders.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a really interesting one. Uh, I will say that there's a part of my experience that could not be replicated by other women. And so I'll just go over a little bit those firsts. I was in the first class of women admitted to Princeton. And at that time, there were about 100 of us admitted, if I recall correctly, and the university was about 3,000 men. And I mention that particularly because I think it was tremendously significant for my whole formation as a person and as a leader, because essentially I was an only child. I grew up transient, the only child of only children. So I was never in much of a community
Mm,
for any extended period of time. And so that was kind of my first community when I went to college as a freshman. That was the longest time I had ever lived in one place. And so I really, in those formative years, was kind of formed by a male society.
mm,
And I have to say that that has proven very helpful through my career because, of course, in the beginning, so many of us were pioneers. You were the only woman in the room, or you and one other woman were the only ones. So that initial experience was very significant for me. Then you're right. I am the first woman president of Illinois Wesleyan. I was the first woman president of the College of Worcester, and I was the first woman president of Kenyon College. So all of my presidencies have had that
ah,
aspect. Um, how does that affect? I have written a couple of years ago, I wrote a series of columns for Inside Higher Ed with some thoughts about preparing for and moving into these kinds of leadership roles. Um, I think Well, the generations are different. I think I am very different from the current, say, the student generation that I interact with now. For me, at that time, it was helpful and important, I think, to not worry too much about being that pioneer or being the only one in the room or I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this. All women that I know have experienced this. You're in a committee, you're in a room, and you enunciate an idea, and it's as if no one had ever spoken. Then a man says exactly the same thing, and it's adjudged to be brilliant by everyone in the room, right?
Oh, yes.
We have all
We've all
that
had that.
experience.
Yeah.
And it's annoying, but I found for me, the best thing was to just move right on. I didn't think that dwelling on those kinds of things would be uh, particularly productive for me or anybody else. What I did often try to do was use a bit of humor to deflect things.
Mhm.
For me, that was a strategy that was, I don't know, the most comfortable and the most successful, I think. So sure, I mean, I remember being the president of Kenya, and I answered the phone directly rather than my assistant and said, Georgia Nugent. And the person on the other end of the line said, no, I wanted to talk to the president. So you end up with a lot of those things.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So, and I would agree. I think the experience that you describe is very similar to what I have experienced, and also the way I have always approached it, and many of my colleagues. And yet, I think this upcoming generation does approach that very differently. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't know if you have any wisdom or thoughts about that in terms of, how does a woman today navigate the landscape and you know uh, find effectiveness in the role?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to that. I do ponder it. I think we'll probably find, and here's my Greek philosophical thinking again, that there's a mean, that is appropriate. Probably some of us in the older generation were perhaps too ready to accept discriminatory things or inequities in various ways because that helped us to move ahead in a way that was possible at that time. On the other hand, I think some of the sensitivities of the current younger generation will not serve them well. I think there's probably some kind of a balance that will eventually come to.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that. So let me ask you, I want to go back to the pivot you made from a faculty member to the administrative role. And from everything I've read, you are a highly accomplished and a creative teacher in the classroom. So that must have been a, a a very difficult thing, maybe in some ways, to leave the teaching behind, or have you found a way to bring some of that with you in your administrative role?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, as I said, I loved teaching. As you seem to have done a lot of homework on me, so I've won a number of teaching
Yes.
awards and so forth. I taught huge classes at
Yeah.
Brown. My classes grew to 400 students. And so that was a really fun thing. And I love the excitement of seeing the light come on in
Mhm.
someone's eyes, when they love this text that you love. But I do have, I guess, a kind of an odd characteristic. I never look back. So when I made that switch, I just made that switch. Now, well, a little bit when I was at Princeton, I would occasionally teach. Um, and even at Kenyon, I occasionally team taught. The
Mhm.
presidency doesn't really allow you to be regularly in the classroom, but I would team teach occasionally. But I think the way that developed for me was a feeling that we are all teaching all the time.
Uh,
That the actions that you take, the way you interact with others, the way that you try and lead or support others, I think all of those are, in a way, teaching moments.
mm,
So I think I've just kind of thought of it as a metamorphosis into a different way of teaching.
mm. Well, and that cues up very nicely for my next question. I wanted to ask you about your leadership style and approach and how somebody might describe you as a leader, and how that's evolved over the years. So over the course of your presidencies, I'm sure you're a different leader now than you were when you started out.
Mhm.
Maybe.
Probably in ways that I don't fully understand. I laugh when you ask me that because, over my career, I have gone into many, many different kinds of searches, right, for leadership roles. And one is always asked that. And I'm always tempted to say I'm a total tyrant and I make all the decisions and don't talk to anyone. You know, that's, what are we gonna, we're all gonna say, oh, I'm very consensus building, blah, blah, blah. Um, I do think, and I really think that to answer that question, one has to ask actually colleagues rather than the individual,
Mhm.
right? Because I'm probably pretty, I probably don't fully understand how I lead. Um, I do think well, two things. It's touchy ground because I don't want in any way to be stereotyping, but I do believe, as many do, that there is a difference between a woman's style and a man's style
Mm,
much of the time. Even accepting that, as I said, actually understanding a man's style in the way that I was enabled to do has been very helpful. But I think women in general do tend to be um, more sensitive to the strengths of others and the
mhm.
and the interests of others and so forth. I think there's a little bit of that in there. I The interesting part of what you asked to me is something that I've been thinking about a lot, just in the last few months, even. Partly because of some interesting material that's been coming out inside higher ed and
Mm,
other trade sorts of papers or outlets. I, I perceive a very large difference between the expectations of a president now and the expectations that I had, and I think others had of me when I started.
mm,
So there's a new kind of leadership that is much more concerned with all of the buzzwords that we're hearing these days, um, belonging, feeling appreciated, so forth and so on. Now, again, that kind of, I don't know, more empathetic movement is probably possible and probably positive, but it's very different from the expectations I had of myself. So I was concentrating through almost all of my career much more on moving the organization forward, making change, making progress, maintaining mission and values. Frankly, it never occurred to me, certainly earlier in my career, that I should be really focused on people's families and their dogs and their, it's just been an evolution in leadership, certainly in higher education. And as far as I can tell, even in the corporate world.
mm. Yeah, what you describe also suggests that the job is much more complex because all of those expectations that you had early on, I think are still a part of the job.
I agree.
The public expects that colleges and universities are going to be fiscally responsible, that they're going to do a good job of educating students, that there's going to be transparency, on and on and on, but also that you're going to ensure that there's inclusion and a sense of belonging. And so I
Safety and
and safety
like
and all.
psychological safety. And I mean, you know, it will sound ludicrous in today's environment, but I never gave a thought years ago to students' mental health. What's
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And today that is a major, you know, it's a major focus of leaders, of parents, of the students themselves. It's just a tremendous shift in our society, I think.
So what does it take today? If you're starting out as a college president, that's a pretty big that's a pretty big order
Yeah.
to try to fulfill.
Well, I suppose if I tried to, um, you know, look at it through a positive lens, I would say ideally, this sort of broadening of the expectations perhaps enables people to bring a more complete self to the
Mm,
job.
mm.
Um, I don't know whether that's going to be, in the end, is that going to be a positive or a negative? Because is it going to be asking too much? You know, it will remain to be seen. But I think that today, any leader in our environment is going to be expected to have a major concern about belonging, about safety, about feeling good about yourself. Those are different expectations, and I don't know how they'll play out.
And very challenging, as you know, to try to shape on a college campus. You know, as a student of the organization, you know better than most just how challenging it can be um, to make
Yeah,
that happen.
it is. And it's, well, I sometimes think whatever the current social issues or ills are, they sort of cluster on a college campus.
Mm,
And I think, you know, we're seeing that in the horrible congressional hearing
yeah,
that really focused on those three women leaders and for the most part destroyed them.
yeah, yeah. So, let me ask you about your legacy, because you are stepping down, you're retiring, from the current
Well, I'm
role.
stepping down. We'll
You're
see
stepping
what comes
down.
next.
You know, I wasn't sure because if retire, if that was part of the word, or so you're stepping down, at the end of this academic year. That's correct. So as you consider the roles you've held over the years, and particularly now stepping down, leaving Illinois Wesleyan, how do you want to be remembered? How do you hope that your legacy will be remembered in terms, particularly the presidential roles that you've held?
Mhm. Well, I've never thought of a legacy. Um, I guess I do feel that I've had a lot of opportunities over the years in different ways, some of them as a teacher and many of them as a leader. I've had wonderful opportunities to support others and help them to find their path. As you probably know, I'm the chair emerita of the HERS board,
Yeah.
and the mission of HERS is uh, to work particularly with women to help them discern what they would like their career path and life path to be. So that was very meaningful work to me, and I think influenced what I did in other contexts. So I think one of the things I'm most proud of is having been able, particularly with women, to you know, to mentor to some extent and to just help them
Mm.
discern a path that was right for them. As far as the I don't know, legacies in a more sort of concrete sense, at Kenyon, I was able to accomplish a lot. I raised $250 million, and we were able to construct many facilities. I built a whole new residential neighborhood. I brought new departments, a Center for the Study of American Democracy, Latino studies, Arabic studies. So it was very satisfying because with that kind of a successful campaign and very supportive alumni and also parents which is, I think, a little bit unusual at Kenyon. We were just able to accomplish so
Mhm.
much. The Kenyon Review, which has been really, a flagship of the college for 70 years, I guess, was kind of flailing when I came into office. And we managed to find ways to turn that around. And I think it's the only literary review that has a major endowment now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of very tangible legacy at Kenyon. At Worcester, I was a 1 year interim,
Mhm.
but I am proud of that because we managed to accomplish a lot. A lot of that work had to do with empowering staff
Mm.
and in general trying to build bridges between faculty and staff, to some extent between the college and the community, although that relationship was already pretty good. But I felt like for a year's tenure, we actually were able to make some significant change there. Here, um, you know, these last 5 years for any of us have been very rocky.
Yeah.
I came into office in August of 19. Um, by November, I was appointed the ongoing
Mhm.
president. And by January, I needed to begin program review.
Yeah.
And and frankly, I knew that I would have to cut some things. So that was difficult because there was no, if you think about really coming into office in November and then beginning this work in January, well, a college campus is sort of inert during
Yeah.
that holiday season. So it was hard to do that review work. It was, as I think is true everywhere, it was unsettling to the campus. It was not well received. And every place that I have seen, and everyone is doing it now, there are votes of no
Mhm.
confidence, there are protests, there are whatever. Now, that didn't happen here, but it was an unfortunate way to come into office. So we're talking January of 2020, and then by March, COVID hits.
Yes.
So, and that sort of eats up the next almost 3 years.
Yeah.
And that period was, it was, very difficult for everyone, of course, especially in the beginning when we all thought it would be a fatal disease if
Yeah.
we, but I'm proud of that period. I think we made some good decisions. We managed the pandemic very well here. We were able to bring students back quite soon. I made a decision that was a little difficult at the time. I thought if we were going to bring students back, they needed to be able to be in singles.
Mm.
And we couldn't do that. We don't have that much housing stock. So I made the decision that we would use $1 million to house students
Mm.
in hotels. Now, in the end, that was reimbursed by federal funds. But at the time, I had no idea that would happen. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
Right.
So we got through COVID, people come back on campus, and we are still involved in the sort of cost cutting and new program development and some organizational changes, which again, we're seeing all around us. So it's, I'm proud to have been here. Uh, our students are great. Our alumni are incredible for their love of the university and their accomplishments. I'm just stunned when I meet alumni. So that's all been great, but it has been much harder than the earlier presidencies.
So how have you remained resilient and positive through through that? Because you're right. This is, you're describing very different presidential experiences. And
Yeah,
so I am
I
curious
don't
because
know.
you seem like a very positive person. So
Yeah,
I'm
I'm just kind of an upbeat person. I don't know.
yeah,
Whatever comes, and you deal with it. And as I said before, I never look back.
yeah.
Someone, I don't, we had candidates for the presidency here recently. And I was showing them through the president's house on campus. And one of them said to me, well, will you miss all this? And I just unconsciously said, no. I just don't, I move on to the next thing, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
So it's I think that's just a personality trait. Um
yeah.
so I said I don't think of this as retiring because I know I'm not the retiring type. I'll be doing something. I told the board that I wanted to leave at the end of this year because my husband and I are really much more focused in New York and Princeton.
Oh, mm-hmm.
So it's been a long time to live in the Midwest. So we have a beautiful home in Princeton, an apartment in Manhattan, and I'm kind of ready to get back to the East Coast.
Yeah, well, it'll be great to have you back on the East Coast. I'm East Coast
Yes,
situated. So, and there's a lot, as you know, in New York to keep one energized and busy. So, um,
absolutely.
I did want to ask you about the Kenyan experience because that sounds like a wonderful time of building and momentum. So,
Yes.
as you look at your experience there, how do you account for all of the momentum? And are there some particular things, specific things that you did that you can look back to and say, yeah, that those were really important things to do in terms of the building of the college?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I came into a very positive situation. Kenyon has such a strong tradition, such a such a strong sense of identity,
Mhm.
and a great deal of support. I used to kid, as I said, we have always been partly based in New York, and when I would be on the sidewalks of Manhattan, I would be much more recognized as a Kenyan person than I would be in Columbus, Ohio.
Ah,
So it has a very strong Coast and New York
mhm.
base, and that translates pretty directly into resources.
Mm,
So we were able to have this very successful campaign, but also the community was a part of that. I mean, the surrounding
mm.
community. And there is a particular alumnus who is um, very, very wealthy and a tremendous supporter of the college. So, as so often is the case, resources enable you to do a lot.
Indeed. Well, and you did your fundraising results are really significant there.
Yeah, we
So
were proud of that. And one of the things I'm most proud of is I really did want to raise the profile of the arts. The
yeah,
writing is always the identity of Kenyon,
yeah.
but the visual arts. And we did manage to garner the only state funding that had ever been given to a private institution like that for building essentially a gallery museum, in part because it's also a resource for the entire community so that school children can come to this facility now. And that was fun because that involved working with legislators,
Sure.
working with our uh, civic leaders in the surrounding town and so forth. So yeah, there were moments that were really fun.
Yeah. Oh, this it sounds like a wonderful experience. So now, what advice do you give? Because I'm, as you mentioned, and I know you have been a mentor for other um, women in particular who are aspiring to leadership roles. What advice do you give when people come to you and they say, so what do you think? Tell me what it's like to be a president. Should I even go for it? What's it like today? So what kind of advice do you give?
Yeah. Um, well, as I said, some of this is actually in some
Yeah,
pieces I wrote. I think to me, the first most important thing is, sorry, but it's again the Oracle at Delphi, know thyself.
yeah.
You have to you have to come into this kind of role, I think, really understanding your own strengths and your own weaknesses, your own predilections. I think of things like in a crisis, are you energized by that or terrified by that? Some of us are energized. Um, how do you how do you prefer to communicate with people? How do you interact with people? What are your really core values? I think you have to come into this kind of situation with a pretty clear knowledge of all that. Because, for example, I can almost guarantee that at some point, core values will be tested.
Mm.
There will be an instance where it's tempting to be dishonest or to skimp or something, and you have to be very firm in what matters to you and what you believe. And then I think in making that kind of decision, you have to look at the similar match to the institution in terms of its mission. Is that mission something that you truly embrace and want to advance? And if that were not the case, then I think it's probably not the right opportunity. After that, I think I always tell when I come to a new position and I meet with the senior staff who will be my colleagues, I always say that I hope as much as possible to give away the credit and to take the blame. And I think that's important to building a team. So it's also really important to build that team and to surround yourself to the extent that you can with the strongest possible people. I've had really wonderful opportunities with great senior staffs. But you need that. And if you recognize that someone that you perhaps inherited as you come into a role is not at that highest standard, then you have to take action. And that's hard. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, maybe it's me, maybe it'll change. And experience has led me to believe it doesn't change. And you need to act to create the strongest team you can.
Mm.
Um, I think those are probably the things I think of for someone going into a leadership role.
Yeah, no, and I have read your pieces in Inside Higher Ed. We'll include a link in the show notes because they're very good and they speak to what you're talking about here. So what have you most enjoyed about the presidential role?
Uh, I like I like the varied aspect of it. So I guess the two things that um, when you are when you are a faculty member and you go into administration, and this is a different piece that I've written something about, your colleagues say, oh, you've crossed over to the dark side.
Yeah.
And I realized that even though I love teaching, um, in the presidency, I love the fact that you never know what's going to happen and you need to be solving problems.
Mm.
And if you have that kind of disposition, then I think I guess I should add that to the previous response, then these are great situations. If you're someone who wants a kind of consistency, you want to come in every day and teach Cicero, that's good, you do that, but you're not for this role. And I think the problem solving part, so as a president, literally you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The television crew shows up on your campus because something has happened that you don't even know about yet. An angry parent is on the phone. A student has done something completely bizarre. You never know. And I actually thrive on that kind of challenge, sort of, well, what do we do about this? What's the best way to address this? So I think oddly, it's that sort of conceptual thing that has meant a lot to, it's just been a good fit and I enjoy it. Typically on the campuses where I've been, of course, interacting with the students is great. And that goes back, I think, to the teacherly aspect. If you're a teacher, you just enjoy having the opportunity to see young people grow. That's probably one of the most satisfying and phenomenal things that can happen. I mean, currently, you said, I am an upbeat person. Currently, I am very troubled by what we are seeing in this country with the the devaluation of education. I just, my own story, it means so much to me because of the way I saw it could change a life. And the fact that now there are, respectable people saying, oh, don't be educated, don't develop expertise. Expertise is a dirty word. That is a very, very serious path that we're going down. And so, I mean, I guess that comes to me because it's so wonderful to see, as I said, a young person grow. I mean, I can't tell you how many students have said to me at some point, I am not the same person that I was when I came here. I've grown into being another, a, a, a better person, a more fulfilled person. And the fact that we have public voices kind of decrying that, I don't know where this is going to lead, and I'm very concerned about it.
Well, I was going to ask you what you consider to be the most significant challenges facing higher education these days. And so that would certainly be high on your list. Is there anything else, as you look to the future, things that you think
Yeah. Well, I think the most serious one that I see is related to what I just said. We have been immeasurably harmed, I believe, by the idea that there are no facts, there is no discernible truth. It's just, there used to be, was it Patrick Moynihan, right? Used to have the saying about you are entitled to your own beliefs, but not to your own facts, right?
yeah.
Well, today that no longer holds. And so I think that undermining of what is really our purpose in education, even if we never fully achieve it, even if it's kind of asymptotic, the idea that we're searching for a truth is really central. And that has been very seriously eroded. And I don't know how a society can function effectively that way. So that concerns me, and that loss of a sense that there is a truth that might be discovered, that there are values that are more meaningful than others. I think that's putting us in a very precarious position when we also combine it with the strong identity politics that is currently, pretty widespread. I think identity is important. You and I were talking about how it's different to be a woman in certain roles and so forth. But there has to be, I think, kind of overarching that or subtending it, I don't know, a sense of shared humanity. And if we lose that, I just don't see how we avoid kind of total fragmentation.
At the beginning, you said you mentioned tenure, that you had some concerns about tenure, the tenure system. Can you say more about what your concerns are, or where your concerns are lodged?
Sure. How much hot water do you want to get me in?
Well, it's a curious. I'm always curious, particularly since you were a faculty member. You come out of that tradition, which means you probably have a very good broad perspective on this. And I think it would be, but I also don't want to get you into hot water either. So
No, that's okay. I just think I think it's a system that honestly does not work very well for anyone. So the idea that you will be employed for a lifetime, I think, is not, frankly, a healthy one. And all of the rest of the world, aside from Supreme Court justices, and I'd really like to question that now, does not have that kind of situation. So one, it makes academics entirely anomalous, and I think not in a healthy way. So sure, there are academics who are wonderful teachers and or wonderful researchers, and they are productive for their whole lives, and that's great. But the idea that all of the professionals in this area are seeking the guarantee of lifetime employment just seems to me bizarre. Obviously, as an administrator, it's very difficult to introduce innovation or change if you have no ability to make changes in that regard. But the thing that particularly has troubled me, frankly, is the distortion that it introduces to young people.
Mm.
So now I was not as aware of this when in the Ivy League because, I was a faculty member first at Princeton and then at Brown. And although I did get tenure at Brown, in that environment, you're pretty sure that you're not going to get tenure, right? It's like, Princeton, Yale, tenured, at least then, maybe 25% of candidates. In the small college environment, virtually everybody gets tenure. And yet it's a very, I use the word distorting. I discovered when I went to Kenyon that the junior faculty are just kind of terrified that they'll say something that will imperil their tenure. Now, on the one hand, this is baseless because I've read all the dossiers, I've sat in all the committees. I'd say it is never the case that a serious committee determining tenure says, oh, you remember in that faculty meeting, she said X 5 years ago. It's a baseless fear, but it controls them. So there's this golden ring that they're aiming for. And consequently, they're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to do things that would be innovative or that might step out of line. So the argument that tenure ensures academic freedom, I find completely empty because it trains a young generation for 6 or 7 years or whatever it is to not be free.
Yeah.
And then how is it that all of a sudden they're going to change?
Yeah.
So I just find at the pre-tenured, at the untenured or pre-tenured level and at the tenured level, it's a very destructive professional environment, I think.
Well, thank you.
That's weird.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. So we have one question left. We're at the end of our time. And this is our signature question we ask everybody who comes on the podcast. So here's the question. If you could leave one transformative idea or piece of advice that would shape the future of higher education, what would it be and why?
I have been concerned with this for a long time. We need to change the insane business model. Everyone who is not in academe believes that students are paying $100,000 a year for education. And that is not what's happening, but it is a major because of the discounting, which is absurd. So we advertise that our tuition is $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. What colleges actually function with is about $18,000 in tuition. But that broken business model, I think, is a large part of the public's lack of confidence in higher education. If we could change that, I think that would be a major thing that would improve higher education in this country. And I'll tell you, I don't know whether you know this or not, there was a time, it was the last 2 years that I was at Kenyon, that I tried to introduce this, the importance of actually directing our financial aid to need and not to so-called merit. And I tried to advance that with some of the presidential associations, merely in conversation. We did nothing. I just tried to open the topic and hold some conversations about it. And the Department of Justice came after me. So there is a very strong feeling at the DOJ that education is an industry just like any other. And if we tried to do a better job of directing our limited resources to those who actually need them, we would be in collusion. And so even President Obama once called a group of presidents and said, why can't you guys fix this broken system? And the presidents had to say, Mr. President, we are not permitted to.
Mm,
So that to me, it sounds very corporate, I guess, but I think it has kind of eaten away at the confidence of the public in higher education.
mm. Boy, I didn't know that the story that you shared. It's a stunning story, but not surprising, unfortunately. So thank you for your thinking on that point. I think that's a really important the whole question of cost and institutional viability, particularly for our smaller colleges that are resource constrained to begin with. So um,
Absolutely. And as you know, I mean, now all of the smaller colleges and even some of the much better known colleges are, discounting at an average over
yeah,
50%.
yeah.
Well, if the business model is we give away more than we take in, that's not going to work.
Well, maybe you can take this up again in your next phase of life.
I might. I just might.
So, well, Georgia, thank you so very much for spending this time with me and for sharing your insights and your experience. I'm excited for our listeners to get to know you better and to learn from you.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.